state. I come from this particular country. That's where I get my identity from. Yeah, being involved in the social world. Yes. And then in the Middle East, how do they dress? Dress very modestly, don't they? Yeah, if you're lucky, you can see their face and their hands and their toenails. But in Greece, when they exercise in the nude. Very different kind of tradition. And Jews, Hebraic tradition is very sexually conservative. There's loads of laws in the Old Testament and Leviticus about who you're allowed to marry and who you're not allowed to marry. And whereas in Greece it's sexually very liberal. So paedophilia, having sex with little boys, was perfectly acceptable. Yeah? So it's a very different kind of thing. So you can see here, you can't say really that one is wrong and one is right and one is wrong. They're both necessary, they're both complementary. If you just have one without the other, it tends to become either very fanatical on the Hebraic religious side or very dissolute and corrupted on the Hellenistic side. Both of these need to be synthesized. And that's the thing. So where was the synthesis achieved then? If we go back to the Middle Ages, who achieved this kind of synthesis? Before Martin Luther? Yes, Thomas Aquinas. So I'm skipping out a bit here, skipping out Baghdad and Spain, where the similar synthesis was achieved within Islamic and Jewish worlds. But if you look at Thomas Aquinas, he was, as you know, philosopher, theologian, and monk. And he was able to synthesize Aristotle and Christian thought. And this became the medieval synthesis, and this is the basis of Western Christianity. So up until today, Thomas Aquinas is basically the official theologian of the Catholic Church. He was able to bring together, synthesize Hebraism, the biblical tradition, and Hellenism, based on Aristotle, the Greek tradition. And so this meant that European Christianity then did this, and so European Christianity made a foundation to receive the Messiah. The Islamic world did this also, but it lost it after a while. But the medieval world, as you know, became very corrupted, became very ossified, and so God wanted to establish and realize the three blessings, but the medieval society was making that impossible. So skip through this very quickly. So the original mind was very repressed, and the free development was very blocked. So it's a very feudalistic society. So in feudalism, society is very, very stratified. Yes, lots and lots of different class divisions. And there's very little social, economic freedom. So if your father was a blacksmith in the Middle Ages, what were you going to do with your life? Be a blacksmith. Supposing you wanted to be a violinist and play in the orchestra for the... Did they have violins in those days? I suppose it is Stradivarius. If I wanted to play in the orchestra for the king, could you do that? No. It's a very stratified society. You were born into a certain place in society, and that's where you lived, and that's where you died. There's very, very little social movement, very little social freedom, and very little economic freedom. You couldn't decide, right, my father's a blacksmith, but I'm going to go and open a shop selling clothes. You couldn't do that. You couldn't change from one profession to another profession. The jobs weren't advertised. You could apply from anywhere you liked. It was that kind of society, very little social mobility. So you can imagine how frustrating it must have been. You may have been born incredibly intelligent, but you had no choice, because you're a peasant, but to go around digging and planting potatoes and wheat and, harvesting apples. You had no choice. That was it. That was your lot in life. Anyway, the church itself became very secularized and very corrupt, very ritualistic, dogmatic, and, that's the way it was. And so the path for people to restore their original nature was blocked. People couldn't fulfill their potential in a medieval feudal society. But it's a bit like, when you make a road, and after a few years, the grass starts popping out. That's original human nature is irrepressible. It doesn't matter how much society tries to repress people. At the end of the day, the human heart wants to break free and to be able to achieve and fulfill its potential, and wants the freedom to be responsible, the freedom to realize the three blessings. And so this led then eventually to the breakdown of these barriers, particularly through the Renaissance and the Reformation, and to the so that a society could be created where people had the possibility of establishing the three blessings. So in the medieval society, people couldn't establish the three blessings. So what do the three blessings mean? First one is about becoming a mature person, achieving your own personal relationship with God, becoming one with God. So this requires religious freedom, so you can worship God in the way you choose to worship God. You can develop your own relationship with God. So in order for that to happen, you need religious freedom to be able to explore this whole realm of ideas. Also, you need to have the rule of law, so that you can live your life without the government coming along or somebody else coming along and killing you or taking away your house or all your belongings. You need to have a society protected by the rule of law, which means that there's justice, which means that the second blessing can be realized of a peaceful society based upon the rule of law and justice. And third blessing, taking dominion over the creation, means that people have to be able to own property. It has to be property ownership. So people can say, right, this field belongs to me. I can decide what I'm going to plant in it. This house belongs to me. I can decide what color to paint the front door, or whether to extend it, or whatever else I want to do with it. Or maybe I can sell my house and go and buy a house somewhere else. Yes, people need that, again, in order to be free. And so this is what I talked about before. And so impetus behind the Renaissance is very interesting. People often think the Renaissance is a bad thing, but actually it's a really good thing. We're created to attain perfection by fulfilling our given responsibility of our own free will, without God's direct assistance. We're then to attain oneness with God and acquire true autonomy. What's autonomy? Yeah, self-governing. The nomos bit means law. So you become self-governing. You decide, I'm an adult, I make my choices, I make my decisions. Nobody tells me what to do, basically. You become a free person, an adult. Therefore, it's a calling of our original nature to pursue freedom and autonomy. The freedom to make decisions, the freedom to make choices, the freedom to be responsible. It's not, having to do what other people tell you to do when you become a mature person. A person of perfect character understands the will of God and puts it into practice through his own insight and reason without the need to rely on revelations from God. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So you don't need to go around waiting for God to tell you what to do. You work it out yourself using your own insight and reason. Hence, it's only natural that we pursue reason and understanding. We're also endowed with God-given right to master the natural world, the third blessing, to tame and cultivate it in order to create a pleasant living environment, etc., etc. So that is the impetus then behind the Renaissance, this desire to be able to realize this original human nature. So where did it start and why? Where did the Renaissance start? Italy? Anybody can be a bit more precise? France? No, it didn't start in France. Sorry? You got the first letters right. Florence, yes. Florence. That's right. Italian city-state started there around about the 14th century, to the extent that people believe in it at all. And the reason why it started there is that people in Florence, they loved freedom. They wanted the freedom to be creative and pursue beauty, truth, and goodness. So if you're an artist, you need to have the freedom to be able to paint the kind of paintings that you want to paint. Instead of having somebody say, right, you're not allowed to paint this kind of painting. You're not allowed to write this kind of music. Not allowed to write these kind of poems. So creative people then need freedom. They want the freedom to be creative. And when you're creating something, you have to make lots of decisions. What kind of paint shall I use? What kind of thing shall I draw? Etc., etc. It's a free, creative act. And so in Florence, it so happened there was good governance, and the Medici family patronized the arts. And then lots of Greek scholars, after Constantinople was conquered, they went off to Italy and the city-states, and the Renaissance started off by imitating Greek and Roman thought and culture. This then became the sort of driving force behind the modern world. And the impetus behind the Reformation, Again, as people advocated humanism, they also rebelled against the ritualism and rules of the church, which were constraining their free devotion. So they couldn't worship God the way they wanted to worship God. If they started to come up with other ideas, they could easily be called a heretic and burnt at the stake. They fought against a stratified feudal system, which we looked at before, and they fought against papal authority, which deprived them of autonomy. In other words, they didn't have the freedom to make their own decisions. They protested the medieval view that faith required unquestioning obedience to the dictates of the church in all areas of life, which denied them the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, based on their own reading of the Bible. They also questioned the otherworldly and ascetic monastic ideal, which devalued the natural world. Okay, so again, you can see the impetus behind the Reformation there was one for freedom, to be able to worship God in the way one wants to worship God, according to one's conscience. So what happened next? Well, some of actually the most devastating wars in the whole of European history, which, because we don't do history much, we don't remember. So the Reformation, actually, the great tragedy of the Reformation was it didn't take place. There are many, many other movements in European history where the church was reformed by the Franciscans, the Dominicans, Augustinians. Many, many monastic orders came and they reformed the church. The great tragedy is that Luther was rejected by the Pope and the Catholic Church wasn't reformed, but what did happen is that Europe was split into two. There were certain princes in northern Germany who supported Luther, and so Germany became divided into two between Catholics and Protestants, and then ensued a long conflict and fighting and wars between Catholics and Protestants. And during these wars, the male population of the German states was reduced by almost a half. Isn't that shocking? Nearly half the men in Germany died during these wars. Yeah, staggering, isn't it? Until finally it came to a peace. But then the whole of Europe then became involved in these religious wars, the 30 Years' War, the most destructive war in European history. The population of the Czech Republic, Moravia, declined by a third due to war, disease, famine, etc. You might think Sweden's a very peaceful people. Do you think Swedes are very peaceful? They have that reputation today, don't they? Well, at this particular time, in the 16th century, the Swedish armies invaded Germany. They destroyed 2,000 castles, 18,000 villages, and 1,500 towns in Germany. So the Swedes destroyed a third of all the German towns. Shocking, isn't it? These incredible wars that racked Europe at this time. Terrible. Anyway, so finally they settled peace and a new political order which more or less exists until today, of sovereign states where you don't go around interfering in each other's affairs. Okay, so that's what happened there. So we're going to move on to the next part, which is what I really wanted to talk about, which is here, again, the Cain-type world is to submit to the Abel-type world to establish the worldwide foundation of substance. So we have this split, we have the development now of an enlightenment. And what led to the Enlightenment? Well, the Renaissance, it elevated the dignity of the human being and the value of the natural world over devotion to God. So people started painting these beautiful pictures, Michelangelo did these amazing statues of people like David and all these sort of things. But then a sort of balance became a little bit this way. And people value the human world, natural world, over devotion to God. And he saw to the value of the human being, which is a good thing. And they sought to understand everything by reason and experience, logic and experiment. And so this led to the development of rationalism and empiricism and the breakdown of medieval synthesis, which had been established by Thomas Aquinas, who was able to synthesize faith and reason, and experience. And so the basic tradition or approach to the Enlightenment was to question values, question traditions, question doctrines. Why should we be doing this? Well, because your dad does it. Why should I do it? Because your grandfather. We've always done it this way, and we're always going to do it this way. But why? And so people are always questioning traditions. There must be some logical explanation to support this, not just tradition. And doctrines, again, people started to look at these rationally. And a lot of this came out of the Reformation, actually, and also rejection of revelation as a sole authority. So some streams of the Enlightenment, which is a good movement, were invaded by Satan. and they became materialistic and atheistic. Now, the divine principle the book doesn't actually analyze this very well. It stops. It sort of, peters out, really. So I'm just analyze it a little bit more here. And to try and understand how the Enlightenment developed in different countries, then you can see where the foundation to receive the Messiah was established. So I'll have a look, first of all, at the English Enlightenment. And this was sparked off, really, by the sort of development of deism. So, along with the Reformation, what did Luther say was the sole source of authority for Protestants? The Bible, yes? The Bible. Whereas over the Catholic Church, it's the tradition, and the Bible is part of the tradition. And the way in which you interpret the Bible is determined by the Church. But Luther said, well, doing away with all this, we're just going to base everything upon the Bible. If it's not in the Bible, it cannot be true. What happens when you look at the Bible? What do you notice? Contradictions. It's full of contradictions. How many lives of Jesus are there? 4 Gospels. Are they all do they all tell the story in the same way? No. It's all very different, about the resurrection, for example, about this. If you compare the lineage of Jesus in one book in Luke and the lineage of Jesus in Matthew, they haven't got the same ancestors. What's going on here? So when you start to look at the Bible using reason and logic, you start to realize it's full of contradictions. So what do? Reject it. You can reject it. And so that's what some people did. So the Reformation then led to the focus upon the Bible. You study the Bible using your reason, guided by the Holy Spirit. And sometimes the Holy Spirit was on holiday, so just the critical faculties of the reason, rationality came out, and people found all these contradictions, and some people just junked it. Said it's just, fairy stories, load of rubbish, full of contradictions. Anyway, so deism developed, and so this, as a sort of outgrowth of this, was an attempt to try and, recognizing the Bible is full of contradictions, let's try and make a reasonable religion, a religion based upon reason. So we'll scrap the miracles, because we know that people can't really walk on water. We'll scrap all these sorts of things, and we'll just base our theology upon reason. But actually, this, in the end, it led to sort of practical atheism. And this is what developed in England. And the deists said, if it's not reasonable, if it's not logical, it's not true. But anyway, in England, the English church, the Church of England, was intellectually quite vital and alive. And the 2 particular people, William Law, who was a priest, he wrote, called a serious, I can't remember the name of the book now, so many years since I read it. He wrote this book, and also Bishop Butler wrote a book called An Analogy of Religion, and here they took on the arguments of the deists, and they showed that they were lacking, showed that their reason has limitations. There are limitations to what reason is able to explain. There are lots of things which are unreasonable, but they're still true, which of course is a basic empiricist position. Not everything can be explained by reason. And so deism then in England was intellectually defeated, and it sort of declined. And then since that time, the whole of English culture and tradition up until about 1950 remained Christian, deeply permeated by Christian values and traditions. And so the intellectuals were still members of the Church of England, or Methodist Church, and they still were believers in God. So you had Isaac Newton, the great scientist, who wrote maths and physics and things, but also wrote lots of commentaries on the Bible. He was very interested in God. And they had John Locke, who was an empiricist, who laid the intellectual foundations on liberal democracy. But also he wrote a book called Reasonable Christianity, to try and persuade people that Christianity is a very reasonable religion to believe in. And so the Enlightenment in England took place within the church. And then you had Bishop Berkeley, who was a bishop in the Church of England. He was actually not from England, though, was he, Martin? He was from Ireland. Was it the Church of England, though? Yeah, he was from Ireland. And again, he's a bishop, and he also developed empirical thought and philosophy. But again, as I said, this development of the Enlightenment took place within the church. And so when the English Revolution came in 1640, it was permeated by religious people. You had, what's his name? Oliver Cromwell, who is a very basically all the people involved in the English Revolution to get rid of Charles I and established a liberal and more democratic society were religious people, permeated by religious values and sentiments. And then later on, the Glorious Revolution, 1688, was the same. And so the impetus here was to develop and to found a religious, liberal and democratic society. So you can see here the synthesis took place between the Christian tradition and the Enlightenment Hellenistic tradition was established in England. There's a synthesis of Hebraism and Hellenism. So empiricism, by the way, it means truth comes from experience. Of course, it can become rather skeptical because experience is very messy. And then you had English spiritual revival, many spiritual groups following the Reformation, particularly in the Commonwealth, and you had the development, the Puritans, who decided England wasn't the way they wanted it to be. They're a little bit narrow-minded, to be perfectly honest. And so they decided they couldn't persuade everybody else to be as narrow-minded as they were, so they went to America. And mostly they came from Cambridge University and went on the Mayflower in 1640. But then during the Commonwealth time, you had George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, and you had a whole outpouring of spiritual groups at this time. The Muggletonians and all sorts of funny groups. And then a century later, you had John Wesley, who came and tried to reform the Church of England. They ended up developing Methodism, but also as an evangelical revival within the Church of England as well. And here's this emphasis upon personal social regeneration. Or George Whitefield, who sparked off the Great Awakening in America, is also very much involved in this country as well. And so in Britain then, you had the establishment of de facto religious freedom and pluralism. You had not just Protestants and Catholics, but you had lots and lots of different kinds of Protestants, Quakers and all sorts of other ones. And so there's a very practical de facto religious freedom and religious liberty. It wasn't perfect, but it's just the way it was. People had all sorts of ideas. Also in Scotland, there was the Scottish Enlightenment. Edinburgh used to be called the Athens of the North a long time ago. Not true, David? Yeah. Got to try and keep the Celtic fringe here happy. Yeah. So here was David Hume, again an empiricist. He's my favourite philosopher. He wrote a treatise on human nature. So the focus, he is interested in human nature. And if you look at human nature, you have to describe human nature. And he talked about the main, the significance, importance of emotion as the primary driving behind why people do things. Anyway, he also developed basic ideas of the free market. He was very humanist and supported the development of liberal democracy. He's actually an agnostic. Then there's Adam Smith, again, in Scotland. His main book was not The Wealth of Nations. His main book was a several-volume edition of The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He was, again, interested in human nature. Why do people do what they do? And very concerned about the moral life of human beings. And based upon this accurate understanding of human nature, he developed arguments to support the free market. Yeah. And then you had Francis Hutcheson, another moral philosopher, utilitarian. Robert Burns, who used to write poems about haggis. And Thomas Reid, another philosopher who wrote The Principles of Common Sense. So the whole Scottish tradition was very humanistic and very moral, and concerned primarily about the virtues of improvement of the individual and society as a whole. And the Scots were very remarkable philosophers, because whereas the French philosophers used to spend most of, as we'll look at in a moment, used to spend most of their time fighting with each other, arguing with each other, and cussing each other out, the Scottish philosophers used to meet up every Saturday night in a... David? In a pub. In Edinburgh, they'd meet up in a dark room in a tavern, and they would drink, and they would discuss philosophy. So Hume and Smith and all these people, and lots of other learned people, they'd meet up and they would talk. So even though they had... They still do. They still do, yes. They're still philosophizers or just drink. Anyway, they weren't, as I said, they were they were friends. They disagreed with each other, but they had a friendship which went beyond disagreement, and they'd often support each other in all sorts of things. And they were just individuals. They had no cult-like following as there was with people like Hegel and Sartre. That was just the way. And so you had this kind of foundation of substance there, this friendship amongst these different philosophers, and it's basically putting their philosophy into practice. And so Britain then, you had the synthesis of Hebraism and Hellenism, and so the foundation to receive the Messiah was established in Britain. A freedom of religion, democracy and the rule of law, and private property and property ownership in the free market. And so, as it says here in the principle, God's 2,000-year providence has prepared a democratic, social, and legal environment which will protect Christ at the second advent. So that democratic, social, legal environment to protect Christ was established in Britain. Yeah? And then it was expanded to the United States of America, 13 colonies, then other parts of the British Empire, and finally has arrived in Korea. And so this is the British Empire in its heyday, the 1920s. And if you add those sort of, miscreants, the United States, then it would be even more red. It's quite remarkable. You look at that tiny little island there, and it ruled a fifth of the surface of the earth. Extraordinary. Let's have a look at the French Enlightenment and see how this developed. So this developed with Descartes, who was a rationalist. So rationalism is that you find out truth through reason. Empiricism, truth, you come from experience. But experience is always very messy. Yes, and so, it's not very dogmatic. Whereas the rationalism tends towards dogmatism and universalism. For example, the question 2 + 2 =, how many right answers are there for that question? 1. Yes, there's only one right answer. It becomes very dogmatic. So if you start, and geometry as well. So Descartes was a great mathematician, an interest in geometry, and thought, how can we apply the laws of mathematics and geometry to the development of society? And of course, you get the development of a plan which society should conform to. Whereas the empirical tradition is, let's study society. Well, actually, there are lots of different ways of doing things that work and that are good. There's not a single model. Lots of different ways that actually work. Whereas if you're working out of maths and geometry, there's only one correct or best model. So it becomes very dogmatic and also very universalist. And so this led also to the... Anyway, so that's the way it was. Anyway, and so deism in England was defeated, but then deist ideas crossed over the channel and they were taken up in France. At that time, France was intellectually, the French church was intellectually very weak because the French king had expelled the Jesuits, who were the Catholic stormtroopers in the intellectual world. And so the French church was unable to engage with these deist ideas and defeat them. And so deism then developed very, very rapidly in France, and generally most intellectuals in France became deists, and then shortly after that they became atheists. And so Satan invaded the Cain-type worldview, the Cain-type view in France. Whereas in England, Satan wasn't able to invade the English Enlightenment because the deist ideas were defeated. But deist ideas of atheism, materialism weren't defeated in France, and so Satan invaded, and the future development of the French Enlightenment. They had people like Voltaire, who mocked religion, made fun of it. Rousseau, who came up with his ideas of social contract, which is basically no space for God there. It's a democratic totalitarianism, a society, everything conforming to the general will. Then you had the encyclopedists, who were atheistic and materialist. And then you had Saint-Simon, who developed the ideas of socialism, again, even though he's called Saint-Simon, he was not a religious person. And so socialism developed there in France. And also lots of other things happened. So when the revolution finally came in France, it was predominantly atheistic, extremely bloody, and led to the establishment of a dictatorship, as opposed to in England, where the revolution led to the reduction of the power of the king. And the reduction of the power of the state, here it led to the huge expansion of the power of the state. And people were told, you're now citizens. That was the primary source of identity, was to be a citizen. This led to the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, which racked the whole of Europe. So France then expanded very rapidly under Napoleon. They invaded Spain, went east also to the German states, Austria, and finally, he invaded Russia. And so that's the way it was. And so the reason why we drive on which side of the road? The left, and everybody else drives on the right, is because Napoleon exported the French revolutionary Enlightenment ideas and imposed them upon the whole of Europe. The metric system, for example, and decimalization, all this sort of modern stuff. Anyway, I'm not going to give you a reactionary sermon. But anyway, so what happened? So there's only one country which stood up against revolutionary France, and that was England. And then England had an ally, Portugal, and so England was defeated quite a few times, but gradually started to work in Spain. And then when Napoleon invaded Russia, he was defeated in Moscow, and then finally Napoleon was defeated. But it's a huge cost, actually, a huge cost in terms of money and manpower to defeat Napoleon and to establish a Europe of free nations once again. So from France then, you had no unity of Hebraism and Hellenism, which is a great tragedy. And so there wasn't a foundation to see the Messiah established in France. And this expanded to continental Europe. It led to totalitarian democracy, German counter-enlightenment and fascism, which we'll look at in a moment. Also communism and Europeanism all came out of this sort of the French Enlightenment. And the cost of Satan invading there, the cost of restoring that was these huge wars to put the genie back in the jar. Let's have a look at the German Enlightenment. So it started off with Spener, who was a pietist, very religious person. Went on to Leibniz, who came up with this sort of monadology, this idea that the universe is made up of spiritual atoms and the universe is a manifestation of a perfect God. Very, very, very pietistic, very, very religious philosophy developed in Germany. And then you had Kant, who was a little bit more rational, achieved a synthesis of rationalism and empiricism, and synthesized the ideas of Descartes and David Hume, and came up with ideas of transcendental idealism. And you had Goethe, who came up with this, wrote a book called Young Werther, and came up with all this sort of stuff about Sturm und Drang. What's this? How do you translate it again? I can't remember how's it translated back again? Anyway. Anyway, Goethe was basically the German Shakespeare, is a brilliant writer, and but he was moved over towards the sort of emotional kind of tradition, and much more emotional, and so there's the development of German Romanticism. Then you had somebody called Hamann and Herder. They were some of the main people who developed the philosophy of language, and anyway, also developed a Romanticism. And the idea of placing emotion over reason. So in the French Enlightenment, reason was over everything. Everything was rationalist. Whereas though in Germany, it's a development of Romanticism, emotion was regarded as being more important than reason. Does it feel right? It may be completely illogical, but does it feel right? This kind of outlook on life. And as I said, this is largely a reaction to the French view. And also the idea of pluralism instead of universalism. So the French was very universalistic. So we've come up with the right ideas here. The metric system, for example, we think everybody should adopt it. And we're going to go and impose it upon everybody else because we think it's the right way of measuring things and everybody should do things in this way. Very universalist. You can see this very much. Whereas the Germans reacted against this because, basically Napoleon was the French Hitler. He stomped all over Germany and he imposed French Enlightenment ideas. The Germans didn't like this and they reacted against this. And in reacting against it, they went a bit the other way. And so rejected universalism and said, actually, there is a different way. There's no reason why Germans should be like the French. Actually developed pluralism. Actually, there are many different ways in which each nation can live its own life in the right way. And so this emotional kind of mystical kind of approach in German philosophy leads to a lot of irrationalism, which you can see developing. And they had somebody called Fichte. He was an idealist, but also took up these ideas and became very nationalistic and very authoritarian. And Hegel developed the ideas of dialectical idealism. And at this point then, the French ideas that the French had imposed upon Germany, the French ideas took root in the German intellectual life. So the German Enlightenment didn't take place within the church. The German Enlightenment took place within the universities. Hegel's ideas are not Christian. Fichte's ideas are not Christian. Whereas the English Enlightenment thinkers, they were all Christians. And so Hegel's ideas became influenced by French atheism led to the development of left-wing Hegelianism, and so Satan invaded the Cain-type view, the Enlightenment view in Germany. And then you had Feuerbach came along, again very atheistic, materialistic, influenced very much Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels' idea of dialectical materialism, historical materialism, of a scientific atheism. And then after that you had Nietzsche come along, who rejected Christianity as a slave morality and talked about the death of God. So we can see here that the sort of German idealism degenerated into communism, fascism, Nazism, and anti-Semitism. And so there's no foundation to receive the Messiah in Germany. So God would have liked to establish a foundation to receive the Messiah in the whole of Europe. But unfortunately, in Russia, Satan invaded the providence and the Enlightenment in Russia. In Germany and France, Satan invaded these Enlightenments as well. It's only the Enlightenment in Britain that made the foundation to receive the Messiah. And so, ideas have consequences. The Cain-type view of life led to totalitarian democracy, French rationalism, German idealism, materialism, and atheism. The Abel-type view of life of British empiricism, spiritual revival, led to the development of liberal democracy. And I'm going to skip a lot of the next bit, just to move on. And so these terrible... There's also then in Britain developed the Industrial Revolution. It's very important. This is some... an evaluation of the Industrial Revolution, the most important event in the history of humanity since the domestication of animals and plants. So when did animals and plants get domesticated? When did cats start to become pets? And dogs and cows? 5, 6, 7, 8, 10,000 years ago? A long time ago. Yeah? So this Industrial Revolution took place started in Britain a couple of hundred years ago. Extraordinarily significant and important event. Because for the first time in history, the living standards of the masses of ordinary people have begun to undergo sustained growth. Nothing remotely like this economic behavior has happened before. So you can see, when I was a child, we used to send money to India and China because people were dying of starvation. Yeah. In the last few decades, huge numbers of people have been lifted out of poverty because of this Industrial Revolution and the adoption of the free market. And who are the people involved with this? They were all religious people, actually. But anyway, as I said, what happened in France and Germany, it was very, very costly to restore it. In France, it led to the Napoleonic Wars, a huge loss of life there to defeat those kind of ideas and to try and put the genie back in the bottle. And then, if you have a look at the First World War, again, because Satan invaded in Germany as well, this led to the development of a certain kind of approach in Germany and led to the First World War. And you look at then, to establish Cain and Abel unity there, restore this where Satan invaded, is a huge cost in order for the Messiah to be born. You look at the casualties there. On the Allied side, which is the United States, Russia, Britain, its empire, and France, 5.5 million people died. Staggering. People, when somebody gets shot in Afghanistan, it's the news, national news. First of all, 5.5 million people perished. Nearly 30 million were wounded. 4 million were missing. Then on the Central Powers, German, Austria, Hungary, Ottoman Empire, again, 4.3 million died. 8.5 million wounded, 3.5 million missing. That's huge numbers, aren't they? Because Satan was able to invade in France and Germany, this was the cost. Because these atheistic, materialistic ideas took over the intellectual world and they influenced the whole of society and led in a really dangerous, wrong direction. Let's look at the Second World War. Haven't got the numbers there. What happened to the numbers? Oh, well. Also, a lot of people died. Millions, countless millions of people died also in the Second World War. So we're living in the world today. You have to think, well, what are the implications of this? If we're going to be involved in the world in which we live, because of certain people in English and Scottish life, intellectuals because of the way in which they made a difference to the intellectual life, and through this the intellectual culture, and then to the culture, political and social culture of the country, then things went in the right direction. Because in some countries, the intellectuals didn't do that. Things went in the wrong direction. So that's why our movement, we've been very much involved, historically, in engaging in the world of ideas. During the 70s and 80s, we're very much involved in a critique of Marxism, Leninism, communism. Very much involved in this. That's why Father started the Washington Times. So to think, how are things developing today? How do we need to be involved and engaged in the world in which we live today? Because that's what I think God is expecting us to do, to become involved and engaged in the intellectual world in which we live. If we're students at university, where is God working today? How is Satan trying to invade the life of my country and of the world in which we live? And how can we get engaged using the principle to combat those kind of ideas and to come up with a critique and a counter-proposal to the ideas that are so prevalent in the world today? When I looked at Hebraism and Hellenism, if you remember, we could see that now, for a long time, England was a very Hebraic Christian country. You can see the swing is going the other way. People are now thinking, well, traditionally, people thought homosexuality is wrong, the Bible says so, all religions have taught it as being wrong. But then the Parliament in 1965 decided, well, it doesn't matter what God says about these things, we can change the law. So human beings decided to change the law about homosexuality. Human beings decided to change the law about all sorts of things, passing laws which are completely against the laws which exist within religious traditions. It's only a matter of time before paedophilia becomes acceptable. That's the last taboo, basically. Child abuse is the last taboo. There's no logical reason why it should be any worse than adultery or anything else, really. Yeah, seriously. And you can see, again, if you look at Victorian England, they even used to hide the piano table legs, didn't they? And are mocked for that. It's very immodest of the piano table legs not to be covered up. Whereas now, I think there's people riding on bicycles without any clothes on. I saw them a couple of months ago. People wanting to have these cycle rides. So you can see the Hellenistic kind of tradition coming to the fore in English society today. And so the thing is, these two need to be in balance. There's nothing wrong. It doesn't mean everybody has to go around looking like a letterbox. But you need to dress modestly. Yeah, it's not one or the other. It's not a question of either you walk around, wearing a burqa, or you walk around without any clothes on. There is a middle way. Yes, and that's why these two seem to be synthesized. Otherwise, you go from one extreme to the other, and one extreme tends to lead to the other extreme. So you have to be involved in these kind of arguments and discussions to argue and to be involved in going in the right way, the middle way. So historically, England was very much involved in this, made the foundation, received the Messiah. The reason why Father was able to live was not because of anything the Koreans did. Left to their own devices, the Koreans would have killed Father. Yeah. The only reason why Father's still alive in the world today is because the United Nations went to Korea and established a free, democratic South Korea, where Father was able to say what he wanted to say freely. The only reason why Father is able to work on the world level stage is because of America. America allowed Father, who's a foreigner, to go and live in to go and live in America and to do whatever he wanted to do in America, starting newspapers and this, that, and the other, be involved in all sorts of things. They allowed him to do that because it's a free country. They could easily have deported him, but they didn't. It's a free country. So the foundation to receive the Messiah and to let the Messiah do whatever he wanted to do was established by this tradition which developed here and expanded here throughout the liberal democratic world. And that was the foundation that enabled Father to be born. The people who lost their lives in the First World War, that made the foundation for Father to be born. The people who lost their lives in the Second World War created the foundation for Father to be able to start his ministry in a relatively free country. And people who lost their lives in the Korean War, so that he could liberate Father from a concentration camp. So again, he could work in South Korea and then go to work on a worldwide stage. So that foundation to receive the Messiah was made here. So why am I saying this? Well, in November the 11th is what day? Remembrance. Armistice Day, and then it's Remembrance Sunday. where you remember the people. Remember the people who gave their lives so we could live in a free and democratic society. The people who gave their lives so the Messiah could be born. The people who gave their lives so the Messiah could start his work. So please, on Remembrance Sunday, please remember the people who gave their lives. And if you can participate in an Armistice Day event at one of the local war memorials, or the Cenotaph, which is the holiest monument in England, then please go there and participate and remember, and to be grateful to all those people in the spiritual world who I'm sure would like to be remembered and appreciated. Okay, so that's the end of my long, endlessly long sermon. Thank you very much.